Today's video will be the first part in a multi-part mini-series where I'm going to take you along with me from start to finish as I run through an actual paid surveying and scanning job I recently completed. I'll explain the planning process, how the data was captured, why I chose the methodology I did, and we'll even run through the data processing and extraction of the final deliverables that the client hired us to provide to them. In this video, we are going to focus on how I plan out a survey control network and the methodology I use during field data acquisition. I'm always fascinated by how other surveyors approach a job and what their thought process is when making the decisions that shape how a project is carried out. They say surveying is an amalgamation of an art and a science. Most of my videos are heavily focused on the science side of things, and there will be plenty of that in this series of videos. But I'm hoping by explaining why I decide to take a particular approach, it will shed a bit of light on the art side of things. A quick disclaimer, this is just my approach, and I'll do my best to explain why I chose it, but it doesn't mean that if another surveyor came along and chose a completely different method to carry out this survey, they couldn't have results that were just as good or better. That's what I love about this job. There's so many different routes one can take to end up at the same finish line. And after 17 years into this, every day still feels new and exciting. And I'm genuinely more excited to wake up on a weekday than a weekend. It's like that old saying goes, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. Hopefully these videos will give you a taste of why I love doing what I do, and maybe you can pick up a tip or trick along the way. This job was a fairly good representation of the majority of work I perform in my current role. Laser scanning infrastructure with the extraction of actionable data from the point cloud. And what would laser scanning be without a bunch of surveying to back it up? So there will be plenty of that involved as well. The caveat to this particular job was we had to meet a very tight timeline, which meant we had to hustle, put in some long days, and be very deliberate with our plan to make sure we were still meeting the accuracy spec provided, but not spending too much time trying to push way past it. Remember, time and accuracy are often a balancing act when it comes to surveying. The actual request wasn't too complicated. We needed to scan the exterior of a 90,000 square foot building that was in the middle of a full restoration so that custom exterior siding could be prefabricated off-site and arrive cut to size and ready for installation. The client needed exterior floor plans at each level and elevation views for each wall in the form of an AutoCAD drawing, something we've done many times before. This particular building had a ton of windows, door openings, jogs, and the building had multiple partial floors that meant I would have to get up on various rooftops to scan every inch of exterior wall of the building. Why does that matter? Because I knew going into this, cloud-to-cloud registration was going to be an issue between these rooftop scans and the exterior ground floor perimeter scans due to a relatively large distance between the different areas. This meant tight survey control was going to be especially important. Could this job have been done conventionally with a total station? Possibly, probably. Would it have been as accurate or efficient to do it conventionally? No. The data density provided by a point cloud in a situation like this makes all the difference in the world. This will become more clear once we start digitizing the building and making those elevation views. There were a few other aspects of this job that needed special consideration. It was 1,000 miles away, which meant air travel, which meant being careful about what equipment we packed with us. Also, from the time we received the purchase order to when we had to deliver the CAD drawing was just over 1 week. That's 1 week to plan, fly out, capture the data, process the data, extract the deliverables, perform all QA/QC checks, and deliver everything to the client. And finally, the deliverable had to be to a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter accuracy spec as per the client request. We don't typically work Sundays, but in order to meet the deadline for this job, we took advantage of a Sunday morning flight to try to make the most of the time we had in order to meet the deadline. That meant if we flew in Sunday morning, we would be flying back Tuesday evening. Wednesday was set aside for processing, registration, and QC of the point cloud, as well as starting our accuracy report that we deliver for each job, And if everything went right, Thursday I would be handing off the data for feature extraction to our team that handles that. This would give them just enough time to run through the data, create the deliverable, and send it back to me for final QC before delivering it to the client. When deciding how to approach this job for field capture, considering we had 3 days to fly to site, perform all field work, and fly back, we had to be strategic on who was doing what and when in the field. We couldn't afford to run a 2-man crew through all 3 days or we would never get everything done in time. It just wouldn't have been an efficient approach. We would need to divide and conquer on certain tasks. The plan was that my coworker, Josh White, and I would run the initial control traverse Sunday afternoon and early evening after we landed. I would then process the survey data in the hotel that night and export an adjusted traverse network. Then I would switch over to scanning Monday morning. Josh would take over running the total station to tie in the QC targets and add any additional scan control I needed. Our flight back was Tuesday afternoon, which meant if we didn't get everything we wanted to get done on Monday, we would still have a couple of hours Tuesday morning for cleanup. Day 1, Sunday morning, Josh and I packed up our survey and scanning gear and headed to Orlando International Airport to make our morning flight to LaGuardia Airport in New York. As soon as we passed through security, I grabbed a seat and jumped into StarNet to perform a pre-analysis. If you're not already familiar with StarNet, I have a few videos on it and one specifically dedicated to the pre-analysis tool. But what the pre-analysis tool basically allows me to do is enter in approximate coordinates of my traverse hubs and side shots, the specifications of the instrument and the equipment I'm using, my expected total station observations, and it will run the error propagation on the proposed control network to tell me what the expected quality of the survey control network coordinates will be as long as the observations are free of systematic error and blunders. The accuracy of a total station isn't a mysterious phenomenon. It's based off well understood principles. We don't need a magic crystal ball to figure it out. It's just math, and the crystal ball is calculus and error propagation. StarNet isn't doing anything extraordinary. It's just taking well understood and accepted equations and applying them to our data set. If somebody had a very good understanding on least squares adjustments and error propagation, they could sit down and manually do everything StarNet does. It would just take a master's in math and a few days of longhand mathematics versus what StarNet does almost instantly. All traverses aren't equal, and we could traverse around this building twice using identical tools and equipment and being equally as careful on our measure-ups and centering of equipment, but achieve 2 very different levels of accuracy. Every total station observation has random error we cannot eliminate, but we can reduce with redundant observations. We use StarNet's pre-analysis tool to calculate how many redundant observations are needed to make sure we're not taking way too many after we've already met the accuracy spec we're trying to achieve, or worse yet, not taking enough and failing to hit the accuracy we need. I don't run a pre-analysis on every job I do, but since Josh is relatively new at setting up high accuracy least squares adjusted control networks, I thought it would be a good idea to help guide him on what survey control network geometry would be needed to hit a certain spec and how many redundant observations would be required for each traverse leg. I find it helps visualize exactly why we need to follow the methodology I had prepared for us. It's easy to just say take 3 rounds of observations on each leg and add a common point here, here, and here, but speaking for myself, I learn a lot better when I get an explanation why we're doing things a certain way rather than just being told to do them this way because it's the right way. If it is the right way, then prove it. It ended up being that we would need to run 3 rounds of observations to all 4 main traverse hubs surrounding the building and to each common point used to strengthen each traverse leg. You may not have heard the term common points before. I'm not 100% sure if it's an accepted or well-used term. I originally heard it from my least squares teacher back in university quite some time ago, but it essentially describes a control point that is observed from more than one traverse hub, ideally significantly offline, to help strengthen the geometry of the control network when post-processing the survey data in a least squares adjustment. It allows you to triangulate a traverse leg. They're also useful for providing a check for each traverse leg to help narrow down any issues if you have a bust in the traverse And if there is a blunder on a particular leg between two traverse hubs that goes undetected in the field, the traverse can be saved by rerouting it through the common point and removing the direct observation between the main traverse hubs. Mathematically, an ideal common point would be set 60 degrees offline from each leg so that it creates an isosceles triangle, but this can be difficult to achieve at times given line of sight constraints and isn't completely necessary. It's also not necessary to set up on a common point, just as long as we make common measurements to them from two or more of the main traverse hubs. That being said, on this particular traverse, Josh ended up having to use each one of these extra traverse hubs to tie in QC targets we set later on. Running rounds or taking sets, whatever your software calls it, Trimble, Leica, Topcon, it's usually the same routine more or less. It's the process of measuring multiple sets of observations to the same points using a total station. The data collector software guides you through measuring a set of points, typically on both faces of the instrument, then it automatically repeats these observations for how many ever rounds you set. There are a few reasons I'm a big fan of running rounds when high accuracy is required. One, redundant observations means reducing the random error in the observables that are being retaken each round. So in this case, a new set of distances and directions are measured each round, which means the random error associated with those measurements is reduced by the square root of the number of rounds when the mean is taken. So for example, if you have a 3-second total station, that means the standard deviation of a dual face direction measurement is 3 seconds. But if we take, say, 5 rounds, that 3 seconds gets reduced to 3 over the square root of 5, or 1.4 seconds. Just to be clear, this does not mean that if you're measuring a control point, that the standard deviations of the coordinates of that control point are reduced by the square root of the number of rounds. This is in part because there are still other sources of random error from other measurements that are not being remeasured each round. For example, there is random error in your height of instrument measure up, and you're typically not remeasuring it every round and calculating the mean. And this is just one example of many sources of random error that affect the derived coordinates when using a total station. Every single thing you measure has random error in the measurement. Everything. No measurement is error-free. Height of target, height of instrument, temperature and pressure, centering the prism pole over the control point, the list goes on and on. Some have a much larger impact than others, and when we have the opportunity to reduce them, remember random error can only be reduced, never eliminated, we should take it, if it makes sense to do so. That is to say, the reduction of random error and time spent reducing it must be balanced. I can sit there all day in the field, taking rounds, rotating prism poles, measuring my height of instrument, but at some point the law of diminishing returns plays its part. How do we know when enough is enough? Experience helps. You can try the error propagation program I wrote, Survey Buddy, to see how certain measurements affect coordinate derivation, or Preanalysis in StarNet is fantastic as well. Measuring rounds also gives the operator in the field statistics on the results of those rounds in real time that will immediately tell them if there are any outliers in the measurements. This allows them to make that decision to redo and remove some of those poor observations. An example of when you could expect to see an outlier in a set of rounds is when someone or something momentarily passes through the line of sight of the instrument as we're taking a measurement, which actually isn't too uncommon on busy construction sites like this one. And we did come across 2 outlying observations that were a few minutes out compared to the rest of the measurements in their round that we were able to remove and redo in the field. Although when using StarNet, these bad measurements do stick out like a sore thumb and are easy to remove in there, but by then we cannot retake them as we've already left the site. Now that we've covered rounds, I would like to talk about the difference between single face and dual face measurements. The cost to benefit ratio of taking a phase 1, phase 2 observation versus a single face observation is through the roof. If you're taking a topo shot on a fence or curb, you probably will be fine using a single face observation. If you're shooting in control that requires any reasonable level of accuracy with a total station, I would strongly recommend using both faces of your instrument. When you use both faces of the instrument, you're not only reducing the random error for the reasons we just covered. In fact, that 1 second or 3 second or 5 second accuracy spec of your instrument is random error derived under the contingency that both faces are being used, but you're also removing systematic error as well. And that's the kind of error that can bite you in the ass later if left unchecked. It's very important to understand the distinction between the two. If your instrument has a collimation issue and you're trying to run a traverse while only taking single face observations, when it comes time to close that traverse out, you may regret not taking the extra 3 seconds per observation that it takes to make dual face measurements. It still baffles me a bit when I get raw data back and see a string of control points shot in on a single face. You're really taking a chance doing that, and I haven't used a field software yet that doesn't give you the option to automatically use both faces with a robotic total station, so we're talking about a few extra seconds in the field. It's not just collimation error that gets removed either. Tilting axis error, compensator index error, and the collimation of the EDM are a few other examples. We often get an accuracy specification from our clients without them really understanding what they're actually asking for. It's been apparent to me at least that there's been a lack of understanding of how error propagates not only from our clients, but even from some of the newer surveyors as well in other industries that we deal with. We've probably all heard it and seen it before. Survey crews out there time and time again quoting their work to perfect or less than a millimeter because they had a check shot that happened to land with deltas of 0. I've said it before and I'll say it now. If you have a closing traverse shot or a check shot with 0 deltas, in other words, you stake out a point that you shot in from another hub and you see that the new point lands perfectly on the old point, that does not mean all the traverse points behind you or the points you're staking out now are set perfectly. That's not how random error works. Those check shots or closing shots are great indicators of the magnitude of error you may be dealing with and are important to book and keep track of, but they do not tell a complete story of the accuracy of the work you are performing. This is extremely important to understand because if we tell clients we're capable of setting out perfectly, then they will think it's actually possible and expect it going forward. On this particular job, as in most, the accuracy spec we were given came as a number with no real definition on how it should be verified or at what level of confidence it was at. To be 100% certain that every wall, every floor, every ceiling we model is within a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters of the true dimension is basically impossible. This comes back to normal distribution of error, probability theory, and the empirical rule. There could be an hour-long video on just this subject, and I do cover it in several of my other videos, but to summarize this in a couple sentences, normal distribution tells us that random errors in our redundant measurements tend to cluster around the mean, with fewer errors as we move away from the mean. And the mean should theoretically represent the true value of the measurement as long as no blunders or systematic errors are present. The empirical rule, or 68, 95, 99 rule, gives us a practical way to interpret this distribution. It states that approximately 68% of measurements will fall within 1 standard deviation of the mean, 95 within 2 standard deviations, and 99.7 within 3. This means that to be nearly certain, let's say 99.7% confident, that all our measurements are within a specific tolerance, we need to set that tolerance at 3 times our standard deviation of error. In practice, this often results in unrealistically tight specifications that are difficult or impossible to achieve consistently in the field. There are always going to be outliers. Accuracy is often quantified at a single standard deviation of confidence. However, an argument can be made that that level of confidence is too low for some applications. This is why it's important to make sure your client has at very least a rudimentary understanding of error and confidence levels so that everyone is on the same page. For this project, it was determined that the supplied 1/4 inch accuracy spec represents the root mean squared error for the final deliverable. When residuals follow a normal distribution, one root mean squared error, or RMSE, means about 68% of the residuals will land within plus or minus a quarter inch of zero. This means that if we had a set of QC check shot targets or measurements that we could assume to be true values, and we compare them against our measured values to obtain residuals, the RMSE of those residuals should be a quarter inch or less. You can think of the RMSE as the standard deviation of the residuals. Now, this means that we can't afford to have our survey control network to have coordinates with standard deviations with 68% confidence of that quarter inch, as this would allow for no additional error from the scan data capture and registration or extracting deliverables from the scan data. I usually take the deliverable accuracy spec and cut it in half and use that as the accuracy spec for my control network. This means for this control network, we had to have coordinates accurate to 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters at 68% confidence. Our pre-analysis determined our main traverse hubs and common points met that spec with some buffer, but since the QC targets can really only be observed from a single control point due to not wanting to take reflectorless shots at an oblique angle due to the severe hit to EDM accuracy when doing so, those were quite a bit less accurate. Hence why I decided to take extra measurements to our main traverse hubs, as if we could tighten those coordinates up, anything set from them would be better as well. I could have also foregone rounds and instead take several more shots on the QC targets to even everything out, but overall I wouldn't have saved much time this way and would have ended up with less accurate coordinates to the points I would be registering my scan data to. Well, that's going to do it for this first video in this multi-part series. We covered how and why we're going to use the methodology we are for the surveying aspect of this project. We introduced the job and why the client chose to get it scanned in the first place. And in the next video, we're going to arrive on site, look at the equipment we're going to be using, and how to calibrate that equipment. That should be coming out next Monday morning, so stay tuned and keep an eye out for it. Thank you all for watching, and as always, subscribe if you want, like if you feel it's warranted, and I'll see you next time.